Shalom. This week we are reading Parashat Vayeshev, beginning in Book of Genesis, chapter 37, and we are introduced to Yosef. Yosef HaTzadik, the righteous Joseph. We're going to be reading now for several weeks about his tremendous rise to power, about his success, and we understand that he really had to get down to Egypt in the end, ultimately. This was part of the plan, because the redemption of his own people and the survival of a great many people were dependent on Yosef being in Egypt. So it had to happen. However, in this week's Parsha, we are confronted with the awesome story of the betrayal, the abandonment, and ultimately the sale into slavery of Yosef by his brothers. And soon we'll read about his rise to success. In the meantime, our sages tell us that this sin, the sin of the sale of Yosef, the abandonment of Yosef by his brothers, is one of those sins that was so powerful and it had such a tremendously cosmic, damaging spiritual effect on the world that it literally has to be rectified anew in every generation. And it's a sin, the abandonment and the sale of Yosef, which actually reverberates anew in every generation. And thus it has to be rectified anew. Every generation apparently has its example of the sale of Yosef. And most famously, we read in the liturgy of Yom Kippur, famous accounts of the Roman Emperor Hadrian, who assembled 10 of the greatest righteous sages of Israel at that time. This is in the years immediately after the destruction of the Second Temple, and in this account, the Roman Emperor Hadrian decided that he has a, as it were, heaven-sent job to martyr these 10 rabbis as a punishment for the 10 brothers of Yosef, whom the Torah tells us sold Joseph to Egypt. He actually justifies this to these tzaddikim by explaining to them, after all, doesn't your Torah say that the penalty for selling a fellow Jew, kidnapping a fellow Jew and selling him into slavery is punishable by death, although of course it doesn't apply to the descendants of these person. So he says to these great tzaddikim, you know what, if I could judge those 10 brothers I would, but they're not here now, and there have been none like you, 10 such great Jews who are capable of rectifying this crime. Very amazing story. And ultimately these 10 great tzaddikim, including most famously Rabbi Akiva, also Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, and Rabbi Yishmael the Kohen Gadol, and Rabbi Hanania ben Teradion, Rabbi Chutzpit the interpreter, several others, these men accepted upon themselves the yoke of heaven. Rabbi Akiva, most famously, recited the Shema at the time of his martyrdom, unified the name of God, and they accepted that they indeed were ultimately being held responsible by heaven, just as Hadrian said, to rectify the sin of Yosef in that generation. That's a very famous example of this idea, but what does it really mean? That our sages tell us that the sin was so powerful and so cataclysmic, that it had such a tremendous spiritual devastation on, as it were, this supernal universal infrastructure that has to be rectified in every generation. That really means, when we think about it and we read this Shabbat about the incredible act of the sale of Yosef by his brothers, we realize that our sages are telling us that there is a manifestation of this midah in every generation. So we think about Yosef in the pit, and the verse tells us that the pit was empty and had no water. And Rashi explains that, of course, that means that it was empty of water, but it was filled with snakes and scorpions. It's impossible, I think, to think about Yosef in that pit and then being transferred from one hand to another without thinking of, once again, Gilad Shalit, whom we pray will have as illustrious a comeback, God willing, as Yosef. But is this not clear? Have we not clearly abandoned him? Have we not abandoned, for example, Jonathan Pollard, who did all he could to warn his fellow Jews of impending danger from Iraq, whose concerns were met with mockery by the Arabist State Department? Have we, the Jewish people, not somehow abandoned the righteous Jews, our brethren from Gush Katif, many of whom are still unsettled after their lives were destroyed 4.5 years ago? And are we not daily abandoning, as a people, collectively, are we not abandoning the Temple Mount to the hands of the Islamicists who deny any Jewish connection to our holiest place on earth and who do all they can to destroy the evidence of that connection? And God forbid, if the government of Israel declares a moratorium on Jewish building in the land of Israel to satisfy American demands, and thus turns a blind eye to the plight of its own citizens and indeed to the very purpose of a government, which of course is to protect its own citizens and to safeguard its own land, is that not also abandonment? And have there not been many unfortunate examples in recent history and not so recent history of individuals and governments and communities abandoning others and being abandoned? So I think our sages are teaching us by telling us how this sin reverberates in every generation and must be rectified anew. I think our sages are emphasizing that we are all guilty of this sin of abandonment and betrayal. And this is what our sages mean when they teach us that the sin is so grievous, that it repeats itself constantly and must thus constantly be rectified anew. And we understand that we must all seek a way and see to it that the cycle of Yosef's abandonment and sale by his brothers finally comes to an end.